Been very excited to present this series that we're doing on Wednesday night called Digging Deeper. I said in the beginning, and I still mean it now, that I think unless you understand the Bible chronologically and according to God's covenants and the way that He deals with people, you will never fully understand the Bible message. And so what we've been doing is we have been beginning in the beginning place with the covenants of God and taking them forward in a chronological way. We started with the Edenic covenant, which of course begins in the Garden of Eden. We went then to the Adamic covenant, which is the covenant God made with Adam. There's 7 of these covenants. And then we went to the Noahic covenant that God made with Noah after the flood. And after the flood, we talked about what the world was going to be like with that Noahic covenant. And that led us into our discussion last week of the Table of Nations, where we all originated from in Genesis chapter 10. And that brings us, if you could switch me back up in the booth, that brings us to the Abrahamic covenant that we are going to look at tonight. But in between chapter 10, the Table of Nations, in chapter 12, where the Abrahamic covenant comes in, we have to at least say a few words about chapter 11, which is the Tower of Babel. And the reason we have to say something about it is you remember when we left off in chapter 10 last week, we read the Table of Nations and how the 3 sons of Noah and all their families, God had told them to distribute themselves all over the earth and repopulate the earth after the flood. And instead of doing that, rather than spreading out, Noah's descendants disobeyed God and huddled up in the plains of Shinar in what is modern day Iraq. And so they disobeyed God. They didn't do what God said to do. And they joined together as one people under one government, and they had one ruler, a man that we read about last week in chapter 10, Nimrod, who was the most powerful and strongest man among them. And so Genesis chapter 11 begins with these words. At one time, all the people of the world spoke the same language and used the same words. Now, yes, I suppose they did. If you think about that, if nothing but from a logical and reasonable standpoint, the whole world had been destroyed after the flood. There's only Noah's 3 sons and their 4 wives left, 8 people in the world. God tells them to go repopulate the earth. They do, but you're obviously going to have one family's language, one family's custom early on. And so at one time, this is the beginning of chapter 11, all the people of the world spoke the same language and used the same words. And as the people migrated to the east, they found a plain in the land of Babylonia. That's Iraq. That's the plain of Shinar. And they settled there and they began saying to each other, let's make bricks and harden them with fire. And in this region, bricks were used instead of stone. And tar was used for mortar. Remember where else tar was used? It was used on the ark, right? Keep that in mind. Then they said, come, let's build a great city for ourselves with a tower that reaches into the sky. This will make us famous and keep us from being scattered all over the world. So notice, and we'll see this in a moment in the text, notice what Nimrod does here. Gathers all the people together, one language, one government under him, constructs a skyscraper with waterproofing material. Now, why in the world would anybody build a waterproof tower in the middle of the desert? Well, I think it's pretty simple to think that it could be because they feared another flood. Because Nimrod had convinced them that God was not honest, God was not telling the truth. And so I think at least one explanation is, and maybe a pretty good one, is they expected a flood. So the next verse begins in verse 5 saying, but the Lord came down to look at the city and the tower the people were building. Look, he said, the people are united. They all speak the same language. And after this, nothing they set out to do will be impossible for them. So yes, this is exactly the opposite of what God had told him to do, and this is probably why. Man's pride, led by the most proudful man, Nimrod, is going to gather under one language, one government, and they're going to try to become God themselves. You see, God is against globalism, not because it's a bad idea, but because he doesn't trust the heart of man. Nothing is different today than it would have been then. You put everybody in the world today under one belief system, one thought system, with one language and one government and one ruling hand, and it's not God, and you would have a lot of danger. As long as men are together, when one nation or one group rebels, there is the potential of dragging everybody else down with them. I'm all for global unity as long as it's under the reign of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, Jesus Christ. But if it's not, you got the same problem now that you had back in Genesis chapter 11. So God said, come, let's go down and confuse the people with different languages. Then they won't be able to understand one another. Man's rebellion had to be held in check. So God threw a wrench in man's ability to communicate. He confused the languages. And it caused folks to do what God had told them to do in the first place: scatter and then gravitate toward like language among the peoples that had been divided out in Genesis chapter 10. Now, if I were to ask you to divide the Bible into two parts, where would you divide it? I think almost everybody would say the Old Testament and the New Testament. I wouldn't. I would say, based on the covenants of God and chronologically what happens in the Bible, that the most defining break is between Genesis chapter 11 and Genesis chapter 12. Because in Genesis chapter 12, God's strategy changes altogether as he institutes what is now going to be his fourth covenant among mankind. No longer will he work with mankind as a whole. He's tried that 3 times. Instead, he picks one family through which he will perform his work of redemption that will end in his Son. And beginning in Genesis chapter 12, God chooses a people and another covenant, the Abrahamic covenant. Now, as we move into chapter 12, let me remind you of what happens at the end of chapter 11. This is the account of Shem's family. 2 years after the great flood, when Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad. After Terah was 30 years old, verse 26 says, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. This is the account of Terah's family. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran was the father of Lot. But Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, the land of his birth, while his father Terah was still living. Meanwhile, Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. Milcah and her sister Ikah were daughters of Mair's brother Haran, but Sarah was unable to become pregnant and had no children. One day, Terah took his son Abram, his daughter-in-law Sarai, and his grandson Lot, and moved away from Ur of the Chaldeans. He was headed for the land of Canaan, but they stopped at Haran and settled there. So understand this. If God hadn't baffled the languages and broken up the party at Babel, here would have been a defining episode in mankind's history and to control mankind. Chapter 11 ends with this genealogy of Noah's son, Shem. Noah lived 350 years after the flood. Shem lived 50 years after Abraham's son Isaac was born. Let me tell you why that's important to you right now and why you need to know that information tonight in October of 2020. Because there are skeptics and unbelievers around the world who will say to you that the creation account in the Bible was just passed down word by word through countless generations. It can't really be trusted. The reason we just read that genealogy that we read, because you know I'm not big on reading genealogies, is because here is the truth of the matter. It started there with Lamech, Noah's dad. Lamech was the grandson of Adam. He got what happened directly from Adam. Shem, Noah's son, got it from Lamech. Isaac's 12 sons, the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel, got it from Shem. Just 3 links. Just 3 links because of the longevity of their lives, the oldest living over 900 years, like Noah. Just 3 links take you all the way back from Genesis chapter 12 to the first man, Adam. So you see, in Genesis 1, chapter 11, we are racing through history. That's why I say this is the divide that's the most significant to me. We are racing through history. The first 11 chapters in Genesis cover about 2,000 years. The whole rest of the book of Genesis, beginning with chapter 12 and Abraham, covers about 245 years. And I mean, we also jump some chasms of understanding without a lot of detail, such as what was life like in the Garden of Eden? Well, we don't know. What was life like before the flood? Well, we don't know. What was life like before the fall? Well, we don't know. We know even less before the first creative work. All we know is God. And that is all, my friends, anybody knows. And don't let anybody tell you any different. They're just guessing, and guesses based on nothing. The word science literally means to know, and they don't know. And the reason it's important for you to understand how these genealogies in the first 11 chapters work is you're just 3 links, word to word, all the way back from the time after Abraham to Adam. Now, Genesis chapter 12 then is going to start telling us about Abraham. We finished off at Genesis chapter 11. It says Abram lived in Ur of the Chaldees. This was the wealthiest and most sophisticated civilization in ancient civilization. Ur was known for its extravagances. In fact, we do know, or at least we think we know this, that bathtubs were first used in Ur. Wow. So you might say Ur was hot tub haven. And Abram didn't want to leave there, neither did Sarah. But the Lord said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. The Lord said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. So try to picture this in your mind. It'd make a great movie. Abram comes home from work. He's in a very successful family, an influential family in the most sophisticated and civilized city in the known world. And he comes home from work and he says, honey, pack your bags. We're going to move. Where? I don't know. I don't know. How? I don't know. I can just imagine she wouldn't be used to that answer. I can imagine if I went home and did that, what my wife would say, pack by yourself. And so God promises three very significant things here to Abram in these first three verses. You could say it, you could narrow it to three words. He promises land, a nation, and a blessing. That's more specifically what he offers. Or you could say it this way. He offers sod, seed, and then salvation. That's a less literal way to put it in this promise or this covenant. Now here's what we're going to do right now, because I think this is important. And if you don't know this is another thing you need to know, or you'll get tripped up and confused in Bible history. And therefore you won't be able to explain to anybody who asks you a question. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you then a chronology from this point forward throughout the Old Testament and into the first few verses of the New Testament, and I'm going to do it in 2 or 3 minutes. You say that's not possible. You're probably right. But here's the chronological view of the Abrahamic covenant, which goes all the way up to the time of Christ in one sense. Abraham had Isaac. Isaac had Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, forming the 12 tribes of Israel. Israel, because of a famine, has to travel to Egypt to survive, and they become slaves in Egypt. God raises up Moses in the book of Exodus to lead his people away from Egypt. Moses delivers his people from Egypt and the Pharaoh and heads toward the promised land that God had first promised Abraham in Genesis 12 in the Abrahamic covenant. On the way there, early on the way there, Moses receives the 10 commandments from God on Mount Sinai. Joshua, though, is the one who leads the Israelites into the promised land of Canaan. God raises up judges to lead his people when they're first in the promised land after the conquest. But the people looked at the other lands around them and said, we want kings like everybody else. And God said, a king won't be good for you. And they said, we know better than you do. Not much has changed, has it? And so God gives them 3 kings. The first is Saul, the second is David, and the third is David's son, Solomon. Solomon also says to God, I know better than you do, and so he breaks God's laws to him by marrying foreign wives who lead him and the nation of Israel away. The tribes then split. The kingdom splits. 10 tribes form Israel in the northern kingdom. 2 tribes form Judah in the southern kingdom. The Assyrians take Israel into captivity, and God allows that to happen. The Babylonians take Judah and those 2 tribes into captivity, and God allows that to happen. After 70 years, the Jews return from Babylon and rebuild the temple, and the prophet Nehemiah oversees the rebuilding of those walls around Jerusalem. In the last book, in the Old Testament, Malachi calls the people back to God. 400 years then pass between Malachi and the New Testament book of Matthew being written. Now you got to understand that chronologically. One of the reasons I wanted to do this series is I wanted to put it down on film so that you could go back and see it. And those of you who have never really studied the Bible chronologically all the way through, because the Bible does not appear to us in chronological order, maybe you want to go back and copy those 3 or 4 screens so that you can understand chronologically what happens, because it's important to know. Then the Old Testament ends with the Jews back in their land with only a shadow of their former glory under David and Solomon, surrounded by powerful kingdoms looking for the time when God would send the promised Messiah to deliver his people. So you might ask, after you looked at that chronology, what in the world ever happened to Genesis chapter 12, those first 3 verses? What happened to the part of the promise where God said to Abraham, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. In you all the families, don't forget those 3 lines, all the families of the earth will be blessed. See, God was going to do this through a people, a chosen people, the Jews, but that wasn't the point. That's only how God is accomplishing his purposes. His purpose is for all the people of the earth to be blessed and to be saved. 400 years passed between Malachi and Matthew. During those 4 centuries, empires rise and fall. The Jews scatter all across the Mediterranean world. The synagogues are born among the Jewish people. The Pharisees arise to help try to explain the Torah to them. And Israel is awaiting the coming of this promised Messiah. And so the first verse in the New Testament says, this is a record of the ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, a descendant of David and Abraham. Why does Abraham's name pop up in the very first verse of the New Testament? To teach the Jews and to teach us that the birth of Christ is directly related to the Abrahamic covenant. Directly related. 2,000 years earlier, Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees to come to the promised land and to father a nation which would be the route to the Messiah who would save the whole world. Other gospel writers make a same reference to that. Luke 1:72 says he has been merciful to our ancestors by remembering his sacred covenant. What sacred covenant? The Abrahamic covenant. Luke 2:32 says he is a light to reveal God to all the families. That's what Genesis 12:3 said. All the families, remember I asked you to remember that? He is a light, the Savior, the Messiah is to reveal God to all the nations and is the glory of your people, Israel. Then you get to the time of Christ. We pass over the life of Christ and we come to the book of Acts. It's now AD 33. Jesus has ascended into heaven after his death, burial, and resurrection, leaving behind a tiny band of disciples centered in Jerusalem. Shortly after Pentecost, a lame man is healed in Acts chapter 3. When a crowd gathers, Peter explains to this Jewish crowd largely that Jesus is the one you've been waiting for. You are the children of these prophets, and you are included in the covenant. You are included in the what? The covenant God promised to your ancestors. For God said to Abraham, through your descendants, all the families on earth will be blessed. Here, Peter actually quotes from Genesis 12, verse 3, to explain why the gospel is now being offered to all nations, to everyone who will believe in Jesus. Zechariah understood that. Simeon understood it when we read what he said in Luke. Peter understood it. God is now blessing the whole world through the preaching of the good news of Jesus Christ, and he's tying it back to the original promise that was made in Genesis chapter 12. Over and over and over again, it's being tied back to that here in the early New Testament. Back to our story. In Genesis chapter 12. So Abraham departed from Ur of Chaldees, just as the Lord instructed him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all his wealth, his livestock, and all the people he had taken into his household at Haran, and headed for the land of Canaan. And when they arrived in Canaan, Abram traveled through the land as far as Shechem. Then he set up camp behind the oak at Moreh. That time the area was inhabited by the Canaanites. Remember from last week where the Canaanites came from? These are the descendants of who? That's good. How about everybody else? Ham. These are the descendants of Ham we read about in Genesis chapter 10. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your descendants. And Abram built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord who had appeared to him. After that, Abram traveled south and set up camp in the hill country with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. I love that word Bethel. When he got to Bethel, he built another altar and dedicated it to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there. Now, Bethel is two Hebrew words, Beth and El. Beth means house, El means God. So Bethel is the house of God, where Abram built an altar, and the first thing he did was make a sacrifice and worship God. Let me tell you one of the most common questions that I'm asked, at least about the Bible. The most common questions that I'm ever asked as a preacher almost never have to do with the Bible. They have to do with other things like cremation or different things that we face every day in our life. How to raise a kid, how to deal with an unruly teenager. Got that one today. So those are the most common questions. But biblically, the question I get asked probably as much as any other is, how were people in the Old Testament saved? I mean, we know how people in the New Testament were saved. How were people in the Old Testament saved? Well, people in the Old Testament were saved the same way we are saved today. Some people erroneously think, well, in the Old Testament, that was the dispensation of the law, so people in the Old Testament were saved by keeping the law. Well, then nobody was saved because nobody could keep the law. There was nobody who could keep the law. The whole book of Romans tells us the whole reason for a Messiah was that nobody was capable of keeping the law. Abraham was not capable of keeping the law either. He committed multiple sins, including lying about his wife at least 3 times that we know about, in order to save his own skin and putting her in danger while doing it. Abraham couldn't keep the law. Abraham was saved by faith, period. Both the Old Testament and the New Testament tells us that. So let's skip through and look at the Old Testament telling us that, over into chapter 15. Sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, don't be afraid, Abram. I will protect you, and your reward will be great. You might call this part 2 of the Abrahamic covenant. But Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eleazar, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You've given me no descendants of my own, even though you promised 2 years ago. So one of my servants will be my heir. And the Lord said to him, no, your servant will not be your heir. You will have a son of your own who will be your heir. And the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Are you listening? The Lord did not, well, first of all, there wasn't a law yet, but the Lord did not count him as righteous because of any law. The Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Do you know how the Lord counts you righteous? Same way. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, God made Christ who never sinned to be the offering for our sin so that we could be made right with God through Christ. When God looks at you, he does not see you and your sin. If you are his child and a Christian, he looks at you and sees Christ. Same way with Abram. Same way with Abram. very important for us to understand that. Now, years pass, and there's all sorts of problems. Abram goes to Egypt, lies about Sarah, blah, 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 Lot's problems, Sodom and Gomorrah, blah, 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 and all that happens. And then we get to Abram is 86 years old. His wife comes up, Sarah comes up with a crazy plan to let Abram have a son by her servant Hagar. I'm not going to spend too much time there, not only because you know the story, but because I'm going to dwell on it. I was so impacted by some of the things I read during the course of this study that the next Sunday I preach, which will be about 3 weeks from now, I've written a sermon based on just this. Just what happens between Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, because a lot of the story caught me. But you know what happens there. And that doesn't work out because it never works out for us to try to help God out. So now, Abram is 99 years old. He's got a 13-year-old son named Ishmael by Hagar. And the Lord appears to him and says, I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Serve me faithfully and live a blameless life. I will make a covenant with you, part 3 of the Abrahamic covenant. I will guarantee you countless descendants. And Abram fell face down on the ground. He has heard this before. Then God said to him, this is my covenant with you. I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. What's more, I am changing your name. It will no longer be Abram. Instead, you will be called Abraham, for you will be the father of many nations. I will make you extremely fruitful. Your descendants will become many nations, and kings will be among them. I will confirm my covenant with you and your descendants after you from generation to generation. This is the everlasting covenant. I will always be your God and the God of your descendants after you. Wow. There's a lot of meat there and an awful lot to unpack. But basically, let me try to sum it up in a minute or two this way. God says, you're going to have kids. You're going to have lots of kids. And you're going to have descendants more numerous than the stars in the skies. And you're going to have a son to start it all out. And Abram says, I'm 99 years old. I'm almost 100 years old. Sarah's 90 years old. Sarah is 90 years old. Are you sure you want to do it this way, God? Wait a minute, God. Is there any chance you can instead just bless Ishmael? No. God wanted to do it his way. And do you know one of the reasons why God wanted to do it his way? Because God's going to receive enormous glory by doing it his way. So chapter 21 begins by saying the Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. She became pregnant and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. And this happened at just the time God said it would. And Abraham named their son Isaac. And 8 days after Isaac was born, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded. And Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. You know, Abraham had first made this promise to, God had first made this promise to Abraham 25 years earlier when he was 75 years old. And Sarah had been about 65 years old. You know what? If God had allowed them to have Isaac then, people would have looked around and said, well, this is kind of unusual, but it's not impossible. It's very possible. I know reports of several men in their 70s who have had children. I believe, if I've got this right, I believe Larry King, the famous announcer, had 2 in his 70s and 1 at age 75. Even in today's world, it's not impossible. It has happened, but it's rare for a woman to give birth in her 60s. Maybe if Abraham had been 80 and Sarah had been 70 and they had a child, people would have looked at that and said, that's real strange. Never seen or heard of that before. I got to check out Wikipedia. But probably not totally impossible. But look, when he was 100 and she was 90, everybody looked at that and said, listen, she ought to be a great, great, great grandmother, and now she's a mama. That has to be of God. And so God kept his promise his way in his time so that he would get the glory for doing that which is utterly impossible. That was God's promise and covenant to Abraham. Now, as we go through, and I won't be back until 3 weeks from tonight to continue, and we'll go into the Mosaic or the Sinaitic covenant then. But as we go through and think about the other covenants that we're going to look at, understand this covenant is everlasting and still in effect, because this is the one that produces the Messiah. And you say, well, what is God's promise for me? I see how God's promise was fulfilled here. Here's one of God's hundreds of promises for you. This same God who takes care of me will supply all your needs from his glorious riches, which have been given to us in Christ Jesus.